everyone. I'm Adrian from Audio Excellence. That's Philip with his cap. That's Jay without his cap. And today we're really honored to have John Atkinson. What is your official title now? Chief Tester in Residence?
I'm now the Stereophile's technical editor.
All right.
I'm the editor 1986 through 2019. And before that, I was at HiFi News. Before that, I was a musician. Before that, I was a teacher.
So basically, they've demoted you. You're now just doing measurements.
Well, I mean, I did 33 years, and I thought, well, 33, that's a good place to stand down. Next one would have been 45, of course.
Wow.
And I felt, well, I need to, you know, I was approaching my 70th birthday. I needed to take things a little easier, having been in publishing since 1976, which is, you know, monthly magazine publishing is always high pressure. So I thought it was time to step down, let somebody younger take over.
You hear that, Adrian? You're almost at 30 years.
Let me finish introducing. So I remember as a young punk coming across my first audio magazines in university. They were in this library, and at the time, the only magazines I could find were audio and stereo review, and then the odd time high fidelity. And I remember reading the magazines, and essentially they were all saying the same thing. If it measures well, it should sound fine. And then one day I came across a small little booklet called Stereophile. And I was reading it and I was shocked, horrified that here were people saying that stuff actually sounded different. And then shortly afterwards, as I've detailed in earlier videos, I discovered that Bose wasn't the best sounding speaker in the world, that the Audio Annual Compendium, which listed every possible manufacturer, all the different component specifications, meant very little. Because I heard magically in a little tiny store called Ring Audio, which Philip remembers, a tiny little speaker with a little turntable called a Rega sounded absolutely magical, and that speaker happened to be the LS35As. So I started to find or look for more stereophiles, and eventually it became a monthly publication, and that's when I discovered that John Atkinson was the editor. So I've been reading John's work both from a review standpoint and as also from his measurements, and I've always been very happy to see that his reviews, or at least Stereophile as a magazine, combined both, whereas a lot of other magazines mainly did the subjective. So I've been a huge fan. And so when we started this series of videos that we're titling A Conversation with a Master, I'd made a list of all the people I wanted to talk to, and I didn't care if anybody else wanted to watch these videos. I was just personally very, very interested. And John was right at the very top, and I was scratching my head trying to figure out how to reach him. And I had an earlier email which bounced back. And then I remembered that we have a mutual friend, Bob Deutsch. So I reached out to Bob, and I said, Bob, do you know how I can reach? And so Bob very kindly gave me John's email, and John very graciously said, yes, absolutely, would love to. So here we are. So John, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate this. It's a wonderful dream for me.
Oh, you're welcome, Adrian.
Thank you.
Where do you want to start?
Well, so start from the beginning. And the guys will interject as they go along, because when I told them that we've got John, they were all going, really? That's unbelievable. And Jay sent back an email, because we're not allowed to see each other. He sent back an email and going, wow. That was his email.
No, that was me.
Oh, that was you.
Not Jay.
So anyway, and then I told a bunch of other clients who've been emailing me saying, what's next? And I told them John Atkinson. And just this morning, I just got another email response going, really? That's unbelievable. Please send me the link as soon as it's up. So we're really excited. So let's start from the beginning. If I knew you back in high school, how would I have described you, John? What was John Atkinson back when he was 15, 16 doing just before O levels?
Well, I started, I mean, when I joined, give my age away, I went to started high school in 1959. And first thing I did was I joined the school choir. Second thing I did was start learning to play the violin. And I realized that music, I grew up in a musical family. My parents sung in amateur theatrical productions. But that was when I realized that music was going to play a very important part of my life. However, I had a sort of conflict because I was good at sciences. So my parents wanted me to study the sciences, graduate in the sciences. So all the way through high school, I had this pull between what I was supposed to be doing academically, science, and what I was in love with, which was music. And then came the Beatles. So obviously, like every young boy in the early 60s, I bought a guitar, learned to play guitar. And then in 1964, some friends were forming a band. And they had two guitarists. They didn't want another guitar, but they said, we need a bass player. So I thought, okay, I'll learn bass. And that's when I realized that God intended me to be a bass player, to hold down the group, to give the fundamental sort of ground to everything that it was doing. So,
as opposed to the drummer.
No, it's a bass player. And the comes later in when I joined magazines. But so anyway, graduated high school in '66, went to university, still playing in bands. I studied science at university. And then when I left university, I was working in a science lab doing research and still playing in bands in the evenings and weekends. And then 1972, this drummer I played with in an earlier band called out of the blue and said, I'm doing a tour with this singer-songwriter called Matthew Ellis. He wants a band to go on the road with him, and we're going to record an album at Abbey Road. Will you give up your job in the science lab to go on the road with the band? And of course, I said, absolutely. You know, where do we start? So that was 72. Background in science, always played music. Went on the road with the band, recorded at Abbey Road. I thought, oh my goodness, this is the big time. And then in September 72, the manager, we'd signed to Warner Brothers. They gave us a whole pot of money to make the album and do an American tour. And in September 72, got the news that manager had done a runner with all the money from Warner Brothers.
No.
Abbey Road never got paid. Tour was cancelled. And there I was 3 months after leaving the science lab, unemployed. So anyway, cut a long story short, I went back to university to learn to be a high school science teacher. And then at the same time, ended up playing in bands, clubs, strip clubs, cabaret clubs, anywhere, anyone who would pay me. And so did that. And then in end of 73, got a phone call from the same drummer saying, Helen Shapiro, 1960s singing star in England, needs a backing band. Do you want to join? I said, sure. So went on the road with Helen for nearly 2 years. And then we were doing a TV show in Plymouth, England, and we needed a backing track because TV is all mimed. So we went to this little studio in Cornwall called Sawmills, recorded the backing track, and then the owner of the studio, a producer called Tony Cox, who'd worked with Yes and had a hit with a band called The Young Idea, said, if you guys leave Helen, I'll get you a recording contract and we can do an album. So, okay, 75, we recorded an album at Sawmills, left Helen, the three of us. And that's basically, I'd always been involved in recording ever since my mother had bought me a tape recorder in 1965. And that's where I got familiar with studios, with everything to do with setup, microphones, mixing. And we released an album. Engineer, by the way, was Jerry Boyes, who later went on to do Buena Vista Social Club. Great engineer, learnt by looking over his shoulder how studios work. Album came out on DJM in 75, stiffed, recording career over, band broke up, and then it's 1976. I was still playing. I was playing in a cabaret club in Brighton, England, and my then wife Marie said, you're better at playing than getting paid. You need a job. So I thought, okay, here's an ad in the Guardian newspaper. HiFi News magazine wants an editorial assistant. Apply for it. And so I did what my wife told me. I applied for it, called the number. John Crabb, the editor, answered. And I mean, I was in shock because I'd been reading HiFi News since the late 60s when I first put together a HiFi system. And he invited me in for an interview. I went in. Unfortunately, he had actually gone into hospital for a triple bypass. So I was interviewed by the deputy editor, Paul Messenger, and I got the job. 1976, joined HiFi News as an editorial assistant. And Paul, who later told me the only reason I got the job over somebody else who had applied was because I could spell. So anyway, started HiFi News, editorial assistant, writing news stories, doing interviews with musicians, doing show reports, and basically learned what magazines were from the inside. And then Paul Messenger, deputy editor, left to form HiFi Choice magazine. I took his job as deputy editor, still learning on the job. And in 1982, John Crabb, the editor, was busy writing a book on Beethoven. And he really wasn't involved anymore. I was doing everything at the magazine because he was busy doing the book. And in October 82, I became the editor of HiFi News. I was 34 years old. I'd had a system since the late 60s, but I'd learned magazine publishing from the ground up. And I realized that magazine publishing was what I was put on this earth to have, because it involved my science education. It involved my teaching experience, because you have to make the subject fun for children to learn. It involved music. And as I said, being a bass player where you hold the group together, as editor of a magazine, you hold the magazine together. So there I was, October 82, newly married to my second wife, and then devoted myself to the magazine. Second wife left because I wasn't paying any attention to her. I mean, really, I was obsessed with magazine editing, publishing. And then it was November 85, and I got a phone call from Larry Archibald, who at that time owned Stereophile. He'd bought it from J. Gordon Holt 4 years earlier. And I knew Larry from going to the Stereophile parties at CES. And Larry said, I saw what you did with HiFi News. And, you know, I'd almost doubled the circulation since I became editor. I'd more than doubled the magazine's revenue. And Larry said, I want you to do that for Stereophile. Said, oh, sure, okay. Let's meet up at the CES in January 86, and we can talk about it. Put the phone down, started to pack. Because what had happened was HiFi News had been bought by a big publishing conglomerate, and I was having so many battles with management over what I wanted to do versus what they wanted me to do. So the thought of crossing the Atlantic, buying into Stereophile, becoming the editor, and having total carte blanche on what I wanted to do with the magazine was, you know, that was just a golden opportunity. So that's what happened. Gave my notice in at HiFi, met Larry at the 1986 CES in Las Vegas, drove back to Santa Fe, New Mexico with him, where we planned the next 10 years of publishing Stereophile. Gave my notice in at HiFi News, crossed the Atlantic in May 86, became the editor, and there I stayed for another 33 years.
Wow, that's crazy. So a large part of your early life sounded a bit like the Beatles, and then when you crossed the Atlantic, you actually became a Beatle.
Maybe, yes. You know, I mean, you know, I wasn't playing professionally. I stopped playing professionally in about 18 months after I joined HiFi News. I was still playing evenings and weekends, and I remember I was playing in a pit orchestra in Eastbourne, England, for it was one of those holiday vaudeville type shows, and I'm sitting there in the pit, playing the bass and thinking, I am not getting anything from this. So I stopped performing professionally at that point on the bass guitar. Still played in early music groups and so on, because music was still a passion. But when I moved to America, really, I stopped playing for quite a long time. And again, devoted myself to the magazine because, as you said, Stereophile combined how things measured, how they were technically, with how they sounded. And that was something I had introduced at HiFi News. HiFi News, let me backtrack a bit. When I started reading HiFi News in the late 60s, their reviews were like that. It was, it measures like this and it sounds like that. Then throughout the 70s, they moved away from that. So one of the things I did when I became editor was to move it back to that, move it back to the old way HiFi News was, to the way Stereophile was, that it combined listening and measurements. So when I joined Stereophile, I thought, okay, that's what we need to do here. Continue what I'd started with HiFi News and combine measurements with the listening. And we did that big time in 1989. That's where we really started it properly. And I think, as part of the reason for the magazine's success was giving the reader everything they needed to know about every product we wrote about, whether it was technically well engineered as well as did it sound well. And my deal with Larry was that he would run the business, I would make the magazine what I wanted it to be. And I mean, we just grew all through the late 80s, all the way through the 90s until Larry and I sold it to Peterson Publishing in June 98. Larry was, I think he was burning out as a businessman, and we'd sort of reached the limit of what we could do as a small company. And so that's when we sold. And then, since then, we've had, 5 corporate owners, and all the way through, it's been back to how it was when my last days at HiFi News, where I'm always arguing with the corporate bosses, that what they want me to do is wrong and what I want to do is right. And that's been a somewhat source of stress over the years. But I've always won those arguments because I used to say to them, they say, well, we're really unhappy about this, because, why are you doing all these measurements? But there's too much writing, too many words. And I say, well, look at the numbers, look at the magazine's finances, and you'll see that I'm right. And they go, well, we're not happy about it, but okay, we'll give you another year. And yeah, so it was, as I said, I knew what I wanted to do with the magazine. Larry Archibald gave me that opportunity with Stereophile to build on what Gordon Holt had started. And, that was just the most satisfying thing that happened.
Let me bring you back to a couple of things I was curious about. When you started playing music, and especially when you started gigging, who were the influences that you had as far as music was concerned? What genres did you really enjoy playing?
Well, I think the music, I mean, as I said, we started out because inspired by the Beatles and a British instrumental band called The Shadows. But then when I first heard Motown and Stax Records, Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Booker T and the MGs, and that's what that'd be, 65, I fell in love with that music. That was what I wanted to be, Otis Redding. That really was the biggest influence on me, and the bass player on Motown Records, James Jamerson, who laid down a groove, who could just take the bass and make it sing, and yet still provide that fundamental support for the music and that's going on above.
Okay, and also in some of the things that I read, you said you had put together. Even before, well, actually, before you started working for HiFi News, you had already had an audio system. What was the system back then? Do you remember?
Oh yes, and the first system I ever had. I went to university in England back then. You got a grant to cover your tuition, your books, and everything. So what I did was buy a system: Garrett SP25 turntable, Wharfdale Super Linton speakers, a Kenwood amplifier, Shure M75 EJ cartridge. And I thought it was really good. And then over the, your system evolves. So that was, I replaced the Garrard, which was really the weak link, with a Thorens TD150 AB. And you know, that's when I realized, before Ivor Tiefenbrunn came along, that the turntable was fundamental to the success of the system.
So I have a Thorens. I currently still own a Thorens 150. That's a really great table.
Yeah, my first wife got that when she divorced me. Yeah.
Adrian,
My
do you remember?
second wife got the quad electrostatics when she divorced.
Oh no, that's painful.
No, Adrian, do you remember the grant program that Ontario has?
Yeah, we call it OSAP, on Stereo Student Assistance Program. We call it the
but it's really Ontario Stereo
Acquisition Program. And I used that to buy my first stereo system.
And I did too.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you were at HiFi News before you came over to Stereophile, were there any products that stood out to you now, after all these years, think back and go, wow, that was really ahead of its time, or that's remarkable?
Yes. Looking at different product categories, when I first heard a Krell KSA 50, I thought, I didn't understand the role of the power amplifier in a system until I heard a Krell KSA 50. And it was one of the first full reviews I did for HiFi News in August 83. I fell in love with that amplifier. I still have it. Brought it with me when I came here. I had it adjusted to American voltage. The Audio Research SP10 preamplifier was an eye-opener of what preamplifiers could do, that everything sounded just better through the Audio Research SP10. Only problem with it is it burnt through tubes like crazy. First time I heard the Apogee Scintilla speakers, the big ribbons from Massachusetts, that was an eye-opener again, that there was something about that speaker, the freedom from coloration, the dynamic range, the sheer impact of those speakers, and was just amazing. The quad electrostatics, of course, the originals and the ESL 63s. I don't think the ESL 63s have been equaled in terms of stereo imaging ever. They obviously have limited dynamic range. They don't have great low frequency response, but they were instrumental. And of course, the LS35A you mentioned. I mean, I still have the pair that I bought in 1978, and every now and again I get them out and take a listen. Yes, they're a bit colored compared by modern standards. I really enjoy those speakers.
You know, it's just a little thing I just discovered recently. My brother-in-law, who's still in England, was one of the people that worked on the original LS35A project.
Really?
We were talking, and he says, oh, yeah, you're supposed to be an audiophile. Do you know the LS35A? I said, of course. He says, I used to work on that project. Wow, where did this come from? Well, he used to work for the BBC, and and then decided to become an entrepreneur and became very successful, had a whole bunch of laundromats. I had no idea that up until fairly recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, when I last visited England, that back then a lot of people didn't have washer dryers, and you went to a laundromat to do your laundry. And he owned a whole bunch of them, and became very successful. Yeah. So there you go, little neat thing. Okay, so what were the things that you did to grow the circulation at Stereophile? Because when you took over, Stereophile was a periodical. In other words, you publish every so often.
It's I think in Gordon Holt's final days before he sold, I think he was publishing on average 2.5 issues a year. Larry wanted to get it up to 8 issues a year, and managed. I think in '85 he did 8 issues, and then what I did was when Larry and I mapped out the future, thought we're going to make it a monthly, because you have to keep hitting it every month, keep getting it out there. And so we went monthly with our October '87 issue. So I'd been there 15 months. That was how we planned it. Financially, that was the best thing to do. The next thing we wanted to do was to make it a full-size magazine, because a little digest, I mean, it's nice, but you need to be mainstream in that sense. So we planned to go full size in January '93, ended up doing it in January '94 just because of financial reasons. And again, it all went together, the combining the subjective side, the listening, with the measurements, with the going monthly, going to the larger size, getting a really good team of writers together. I mean, Bob Deutsch, I recruited the end of the '80s. He'd sent me a letter for publication, which was complaining about how much English writers were in the magazine. So I liked the way he wrote. So he joined, first writing about music and then about equipment. Yeah, I mean, it was just, the package just all came together. And we, as I said, we grew steadily throughout the '90s. Circulation peaked in '99, I think. And then we pulled back a little bit. And then it plateaued around 72,000 at the turn of the century and has stayed there.
At the time, I remember what. Sorry?
So I hope that noise is bothering. One of my neighbors has started drilling in the street. So.
It's okay. At the time, I remember one of the things, there were some very interesting things around the period of time. When you took over, suddenly there was this response, if you will, from the Absolute Sound. And suddenly products that were available to Stereophile, you didn't see them reviewed in Absolute Sound and vice versa. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think that was done necessarily. But it was always fascinating because as a fan, I wanted to see the two magazines' perspective, but you rarely ever saw that. What was your reaction to the Absolute Sound responding and becoming, in many respects, even more professional than they were previously, because they started to become also more regular and publishing more regularly?
Yes, I mean, I'd known Harry Pearson when I was at HiFi News. I'd visited him in Seacliff, and his system always sounded magnificent. When I joined Stereophile, Harry at first thought, well, what would an English person know about publishing an American magazine? And then as we went through the '90s, and it became obvious that we were not only eating the Absolute Sound's lunch, but eating audio magazines' lunch. And Harry, so I think, I'm trying to remember when he sold the magazine. It may have been in 2000 or '99. But Harry really was a brilliant writer, brilliant listener, but not the best businessman. And he ended up selling to, trying to remember the history of it. But I mean, then in the 2000s, the Absolute Sound really became, professionally edited, professionally published. And but they never incorporated measurements, and to me that was always an important part of the package that a magazine should offer. Audio magazine we saw as our main competitor through the '90s. I mean, because I knew Gene Pitts very well, and my third wife had actually worked at Audio Magazine as one of their advertising representatives, and so. We got married in '87. She joined Stereophile, and she remembers their Audio's publisher telling everyone at a meeting, "Oh, Stereophile won't be any threat. They're just a little subjective magazine." So I thought, right, we'll take on Audio, and actually, that's what happened. Yeah. So. Yeah.
One of the things that fascinated me, I don't recall where I saw it, but I remember there was an article that, and it might have been a reply that you had made in one of the internet forums about how Stereophile worked very, very hard to separate the review department from the advertising.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. And I remember reading that thinking, good for you, because that meant there wouldn't be any obvious relationship between the two departments and therefore no influence to the reviews, contrary to what everybody was always saying about magazines.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I learned from my predecessor at HiFi News, John Crabb. He said, you have to tell the readers the truth about the products, and if they cancel their advertising, well, they'll come back. They need you. But if you don't tell the truth, then you might please an advertiser, but you'll in the end, the readers will find you out. Readers will go away, and if you don't have readers, you won't have advertisers. So, my whole philosophy with both magazines was tell the truth about the products. If the advertiser has a problem, well, that's the ad rep's problem, not the editor's problem. And as I said, they'll come back. The main ad rep, most of Stereophile's early days, was a man called Ken Nelson, brilliant man. And I remember Ken telling me we'd done a review of some product, and it was one of his clients, and we really didn't like it. Sounded awful, measured terribly. And I said to Ken, you know, I hope it didn't cause you too much trouble. And Ken said, no. It helps to throw an advertiser to the wolves every now and again, keeps all the others in line. Yes, I mean, it's been such a fundamental part of a magazine's success, is keeping the editorial and the advertising departments completely separate. And as I said, I was married to Audio's, you know, most successful ad rep, still am, 32 years later. And all the time we worked together at Stereophile, we never discussed reviews, what I was doing. She would find out what I had said about products when she read it in the magazine, along with everybody else. So you know, you just work at it.